Greetings, friends of liberty. When we examine the history of the English poor laws, those laws first enacted in medieval times in various inchoate forms and modified subsequently, we must admit of their having had a very uneven and checkered history. Certainly, if we were to chart that history, it would be one at times of hills and dales, at others of mesas and canyons, and even occasionally of peaks and chasms. First of cruelty, then undue generosity. So, for example, the Poor Act of 1552, during the reign of Edward VI, assigned a collector of alms to every parish, with a list of the poor to be helped. Begging was utterly prohibited, which, however harsh, was consistent with the assumption that the poor law would eliminate begging. Queen Elizabeth herself, in 1572, agreeing that begging was no longer necessary, ordered a hole to be burned through his ear for the first-time offender and a hanging by the neck for repeat offenders, all for reaching out a hand requesting a donation. However, Elizabeth did also order that those who weren't poor contribute to a poverty relief fund, levying a £10 fine for the refusal to contribute. This imposition, too, was wrong on the part of Elizabeth, since charity was subsequently no longer voluntary, but governmental. A 1601 poor law reaffirmed the parish as the organizational centre of poor relief, paid for by ratepayers. Those incapable of work or ill were given outdoor relief, in other words, clothing and food. But those able-bodied recalcitrants who refused to support themselves were now given beatings or even sent to a workhouse or house of correction. That taught them not to exploit the kindness of their neighbours. One advantage of the system was that the overseers knew the local beggars well enough to usually distinguish between the deserving and undeserving poor, and thus to treat each type accordingly. Over time, more and more workhouses were established, so that by 1776 about 100,000 paupers were to be found in almost 2,000 workhouses and houses of correction throughout England. However, increasingly, as we're seeing now in 1793, the system, far from being abused by the authorities, has now again swung back in the other direction and is being abused by the recipients. So, for example, one recipient threatened the overseer with abandoning his aging mother unless more money was given him. Others conspire with employers, knowing that they will receive a state subsidy for their low wages, thus driving out the honest worker who naturally demands normal, higher wages. Similar schemes apply to the renting of housing, which, since both the landlord and renter know the renter will receive a state subsidy, conspire to charge and pay higher rents than normal, given that the state subsidy will reimburse them in part. This, too, disadvantages the honest renter, who now has to pay a higher rent. All in all, the system is being more and more abused by everyone, so much so we might say that instead of gaining ground in fighting against poverty, we are more and more losing ground. Now, if we turn to instances of counterproductive state welfare in my own 18th century, to those in your own 20th and 21st centuries, we review today one of the greatest books ever written, illustrating and explaining how counterproductive the welfare state really is. That book, appearing in 1984, was economist and social thinker Charles Murray's Losing Ground, American Social Policy, 1950 to 1980. A book so influential that 12 years later, a series of political reforms and legislative acts based on its analysis significantly changed American welfare, making it more efficient and less destructive. Murray begins his substantive discussion by relating ironically how a mere decade before the 60s began in 1950, the leading popular magazines, Time, Newsweek, the Saturday Evening Post, Reader's Digest, contained very little about social or economic injustice. Poverty was so far from being a topic of concern that the lack of poverty was said to be creating, if not exactly a problem, at least a challenge. Who to give all the money to? But that zen feeling of serenity soon changed, with articles emerging from the usual suspects, in this case, Harvard's Robert Heilbronner in 1950, claiming that there were approximately 45 million American poor, or 30% of the population. By 1962, Harvardian JFK added to the push for big government and the changing zeitgeist by saying, the state welfare program must contribute to the attack on dependency, juvenile delinquency, family breakdown, illegitimacy, ill health, and disability. It must reduce the incidence of these problems, prevent their occurrence and reoccurrence, and strengthen and protect the vulnerable in a highly competitive world. This, as Murray notes, was a major departure from the ideas of previous generations and presidents, and showed why Ayn Rand in 1960 had already called JFK a high-class beatnik. But the dilemma always was, from the very beginning, with the Elizabethan poor laws of the 16th century, how is a civilized society to take care of the deserving without encouraging people to become undeserving? How does it do good without engendering vice? Not surprisingly, with the advent of the 60s, this difficulty was increasingly ignored. Even in the 50s, it was clear that some of the recipients of welfare policies, like AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, which had been enacted by FDR's administration in 1935, they were not widows. Many of them had not even been married. Worst of all, they didn't stop having babies after the first lapse. They kept having more. This had not been part of the plan. But all that, not surprisingly, was ignored by JFK, who started the gravy train rolling passing a small program of 59 million in 1963. The slogan was of giving a hand and not a handout, which in the end proved highly ironical. Other forces that urged expansion of the dole were the civil rights movement as a payoff to blacks not to be violent, the great economic prosperity of the 60s, and the new idea about structural poverty of writers like John Harrington and economists like John Kenneth Galbraith and Keynesian Walter Heller of the Johnson administration. Prosperity could just be printed, or at least recessions avoided just by the printing press. So why begrudge the poor a few extra dollars of those we can easily print or spare? And so, as the 60s progressed, budgets for the welfare state started skyrocketing. From 1962, it took 3 more years for the budget to reach 90 million. Then, in a single year, 1966, the budget doubled from 154 million to 313 million. The irony was, however, that just as more money increasingly poured from governmental coffers, contradictory reports arrived from the field. When the reports were read, they led to a rapid loss of innocence about what could be expected. One report was cited by Joseph Califano, principal aide to Lyndon Johnson, who had called reporters into his office to tell them that a government analysis had shown that only 50,000 persons, or 1% of the 7,300,000 on welfare, were capable of being given skills and training to make them self-sufficient. Another was by Daniel Patrick Moynihan's 1969 Maximum Feasible Misunderstanding. Yet another was an LA Times article in 1970 detailing that the vast successes described in the book Oakland's Not Burning for Burning were largely fictional. Nonetheless, the roles of welfare recipients continued enlarging, almost geometrically, sometimes helped by presidential administrations, sometimes by Congress, and others by Supreme Court decisions. For example, the food stamp program under Lyndon Johnson began with 424,000 participants in 1965. By 1980, the number of participants had grown to 21.1 million. Of course, liberals quickly produced reasons for the lack of success. A, the economy was getting worse. B, there were more old people and those eligible for support than ever before. And C, the stats didn't capture the actual improvements. Murray shows all these to be false. A, national GDP constantly increased during the period, increasing even more in the 70s than before. B, working-age people were harmed even more by these welfare programs than the elderly. And C, decreases in net poverty, the best measure of poverty, also flatlined from 1972 onwards. And so, as Ronald Reagan said back in 1986, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And which group was helped the most? Blacks. And which group suffered the most as a result? You guessed it. Number 1, black unemployment among 18 to 24-year-olds, which had declined about 5 percentage points from 1960 to 67, then reversed 13 points from 67 to 80. Number 2, the black-white unemployment ratio worsened from 64 to 80 for 20 to 24-year-olds, from about 1.8 to 1 to about 2.3 to 1. Number 3, labor force participation for both whites and blacks, which, for example, for 16 to 17-year-olds had been the same for both races at 45% in 1955, radically worsened for blacks, with the black rate decreasing to 32%, but the white increasing to 53%, so now a 23% differential. Number 4, poverty declines for blacks on average, which had been radically decreasing from 58% in 1959 to 38% in 1968, almost completely stopped. Number 5, blacks made enormous strides in K-12 school enrollment from 1950 to 65, from 75 to 91% enrollment. But then gains almost flattened, reaching only 94% by 1980, with these stats being in doubt due to faulty public school fudging. Meanwhile, white enrollment dropped from 1965 onwards. College enrollments were similar. The effects on education for both whites and blacks was equally dismal. Number 1, by 1980, remedial mathematics courses constituted a quarter of all mathematics courses taught in public universities. Number 2, traditional performance standards had become meaningless. As homework decreased and real student achievement declined, grades rose. Number 3, because blacks attended so many bad inner-city public schools, made worse by the Great Society programs, their performance on testing, despite their massively increased enrollment, was horrendous. So, for example, on the Armed Forces Qualification Test, given by the Department of Defense, blacks scored an average of about 24 and whites 55. The SAT test showed similar discrepancies in 1980, whereas only 3.5% of white test takers scored less than 300, fully a quarter of black test takers scored in that category. Turning next to the effects on crime. About 1964, the takeoff year varies by type of crime. The crime rate started to climb steeply for both property and violent crime. From 1950 to 1980, violent crime and property crime increased from about 160 per 100,000 to about 570, with the period from 1963 onwards comprising almost all of that rise. Regarding homicides, the white rate was 4 per 100,000 in 1962, and the black 34. By 1980, the white had climbed to 10 and the black to 58, both having about doubled. Not surprisingly, the treatment of those arrested became much more lenient. Sometimes these changes were mandated by court decisions, sometimes they were ordered by administrators, sometimes they just happened as a result of a collective agreement. Turning next to documented effects on the family. Number 1. In 1960, approximately 224,000 children were born to single mothers. In 1980, the number had grown to 665,747. The result was most acute for blacks. In 1980, 48% of live births among blacks were single women, compared with 17% in 1950. White illegitimate births more than quintupled from 2 to 11%. The 1980 teenage fertility rate for U.S. blacks is the highest of all 32 populations examined, 37% higher than the next highest rate for Arab Israelis, who, however, get married very early. Of course, teenagers happen to have more low birth weight babies, who then have greater problems. The striking reality was that the rise for rich families of persons living in single-family households increased from 5 to 9%, only about 4 percentage points from 1960 to 1980, but the rise for poor families increased from 20 to 45%, about 6 times more. The number for blacks was 65%, for whites 34%, in part because blacks were poorer and thus more subject to counterproductive welfare incentives. As Murray describes, why did all this happen? Simply because the basic laws of economics were ignored. 2 of them were, number 1, incentives matter, and number 2, hold people responsible for what they do. Not surprisingly, a study run by the Office of Economic Opportunity, OEO, confirmed this when compiling the results of a huge 10-year welfare program run in many American cities, begun in 1968, involving 8,700 welfare participants. The results? State welfare A lengthened the time of unemployment of those laid off by 43%, and B increased divorce rates by 39%. Murray subsequently creates an imaginary scenario with a fictitious poor couple called Harold and Phyllis to illustrate the differing incentives they faced in 1960 and 1970. In 1960, since Phyllis and Harold's parents are penniless, Harold can take a job or sponge off of Phyllis. But sponging off of her in 1960 wouldn't give much, since she would only get $23 weekly in AFDC payments. And the rules stipulate that she won't be able to add to her income by getting a job herself. In addition, cohabitation is not allowed. All this means that Harold has to get a job at whatever wage he can find, let's say at $40 per week, at a dry cleaning press. And he can't quit, since unemployment insurance will only pay $20 a week. But in 1970, economically, the total package of AFDC and other welfare benefits has become comparable to working. Phyllis can also get rent subsidies and Medicaid, and as long as Harold is not counted legally as the father of their child, his income won't count against her getting benefits. In addition, they can now live together without making either less eligible for payment for welfare. In summary, Harold can get married and work 40 hours a week in a hot, tiresome job, or he can live with Phyllis and their baby without getting married, not work, and have more disposable income. From an economic point of view, getting married is dumb. Generally, in terms of AFDC and the incentives it presented, it provided an incentive to work for those women who were already on welfare. The problem is that the same rule provided a much stronger incentive for women who were not on welfare to get on it and then become trapped in it. Murray provides an illustrative graph which shows that AFDC families as a percentage of all families, 1950 to 1980, rose from 1.6 to 6%. In terms of the criminal justice system and the changing incentives it presented, Murray gives graphs showing that the odds for remaining unarrested for robbery and burglary increased 3 times from 1958 to 1980. In addition, the risk of going to prison after being arrested declined by about 50%. As with other stats, the rich faced the same odds of arrest and prison, but the odds for the poor became much better, which was why their crime rates went way up. As the odds for juveniles became better still, in Chicago on average a juvie would be arrested 13 times before going to reform school. Talk about a revolving door. The schools, too, despite their spending doubling from 1955 to 1980, reflected that vastly increased disorder and violence and lackadaisical standards, with social promotions graduating kids to the next grade automatically. So given the disaster that the welfare state is, the harm it visits upon everyone and always will, the solutions would seem obvious. What does Murray advocate? First, he points out that whenever you start programs to reward people to do good things or stop doing bad things like smoking, you have to reward them a lot to make any sizable difference. But if you do, you'll be drawing people into the program to get those rewards that never otherwise would have been there at all. So, for example, you might get 5% of the 10% of the population which smokes to stop, while at the same time incentivizing 10% of the 90% who don't smoke to start smoking to get the reward. Secondly, some people will stop a bad behavior like smoking in the absence of any rewards anyway. Thirdly, with some of the needy, like paraplegics, it doesn't make sense to think this way because their condition is involuntary. Summarizing all these insights leads Murray to the following formulation of the law of net harm. The less likely it is that the unwanted behavior will change voluntarily, the more likely it is that a program to induce change will cause net harm. Murray adds that, from a moral point of view, it was wrong to take from the most industrious, most responsible poor, take safety, education, justice, status, so that we could cater to the least industrious, least responsible poor. To fix things, he presents three concrete proposals, one for education, one for public welfare, and one for civil rights. Number one, education. Here he advocates the introduction of school vouchers to vastly expand school choice amongst parents. He suggests that the measure will significantly raise black scores. Number two, public welfare. Here he advocates abolishing everything. Perfect. He says we should scrap the entire federal welfare and income support structure for working-age persons, including AFDC, Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, subsidized housing, disability insurance, and the rest. It would leave the working-age person with no recourse whatsoever except the job market, family members, friends, and public or private locally funded services. Cut the knot, for there is no way to untie it. Number three, civil rights. Here he rightly recommends as well to repeal every bit of legislation and reverse every court decision that in any way requires, recommends, or rewards differential treatment according to race. Perfect. Let's turn finally to a brief evaluation of the book and his proposals. This book was rightly regarded as revolutionary because it showed the public for the first time in comprehensive detail the enormous harms caused by the Great Society's war on poverty. For that reason alone, it deserves an A. Even today, 42 years later, it's the perfect introduction, loaded with valuable stats and arguments. As he implies with public welfare, the way to maximize the incentives presented to people is by privatizing everything. And this is for two reasons, which he doesn't explicitly spell out. First, the very incentives whose effect you want to maximize are maximized when people are forced to experience, whether for good or bad, the natural consequences of their behavior. Secondly, private philanthropies and charities can gather and implement knowledge about recipients and decide who needs help and who needs a kick in the pants much better than public agencies. Government is much less effective because it has much less knowledge and utilizes it less effectively. Finally, he should be consistent and recommend with education what he does with public welfare: complete privatization, abolition of the public system. Although school choice is a big step in the right direction, it's still controlled by the state and potentially vulnerable to recapture. And ironically, recapture is exactly what's happened with the American welfare state, which reformed itself substantially around 1996, but has since gone back to its spendthrift ways. Pure privatization of education would bring the maximum increase in reading and math scores, while revolutionaries in K-12 education, in eliminating the many bad ideologies students are forced to learn, such as DEI, CRT, woke and trans ideology, hardcore feminism and environmentalism, and presently virulent anti-Semitism. Of this problem of public education, Murray here makes no mention. Very aware that Social Security and other entitlements are bankrupting America, after which it will have no choice but to reform its welfare state, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.